Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this latest Q&A session of Indica Books. And I'm your host, Abhinav Agarwal, and I have with me two authors, first-time authors. But before I introduce them, I think it is apt that I introduce the book first, because it is a very different book that we are covering from our usual Q&A sessions. For one, it is a coffee table book. It is a gorgeously illustrated book with hundreds and hundreds of photographs of some incredibly beautiful temples. And the third one is, if you look at the testimonials provided in the book, it's a galaxy of some of the most distinguished scholars that you can find. And we had about a couple of months back, we had a book launch event where another, a huge array of scholars came and they graced the occasion, and they shared some very, very nice words about the book, and also talked about some of the history behind these temples. And I have been looking forward to this Q&A personally for a long time. So without further ado, I will introduce the authors. So the book that we are going to talk about, as you can see on the background, is Pallavas and Chalukyas, Co-optation in Stone, with a foreword by Professor Meenakshi Jain, and it has been written and photographed by Bharath and Gurupreet Chopra. So with that, welcome Bharath and welcome Gurupreet.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having us.
So I'll read a little bit about from behind the book, from the back cover, and it says this coffee table book is our endeavor to bring out the glorious achievements of the Pallava and Chalukya dynasties and the awe-inducing temple constructions which have left an indelible mark on India. Their creations were pioneering structures that each subsequent kingdom which followed them learned and adopted from the shores of Mahabalipuram to the great temple town of Kanchi, and from the capital town of Badami to Aihal and Pattadakal, we take you through a picturesque journey of the temples of these two great kingdoms. You will experience the temple architecture, the associated iconography, the inscriptions, the dynamic history, and patrons for the different structures through this visual treat. So, first of all, this is a collaboration between you two, but you nonetheless decided to sort of divide up the task, and you have covered basically Mahabalipuram and Kanchipuram, one of you, and I'll leave it to you to reveal to us who that is. And then on the Chalukya side, you have covered the three towns of Badami, Pattadakal, and Aihal on the other hand. So with that, let's start with whoever has covered the Pallavas. Please raise your hand and tell us a little bit about what... Perfect, you're the winner, Bharath. So please tell us, before I start, the Pallava dynasty you have mentioned in your book started sometime around the 3rd century CE. And it continued from 275, if I recall, and it continued all the way to about 896 CE. So it lasted for roughly 600 years. The Chalukya dynasty, on the other hand, started sometime around 500 CE, and it ended by about 747 CE, if I have got my dates right. So that was so the entire Chalukya dynasty can be seen to be subsumed within the span of the Pallava dynasty, right? Yet the contributions of the Chalukyas are no less. So tell us a little bit about the Pallava dynasty, Bharath, because it is one of the two great dynasties of India that you have covered in your book.
So the origin of this dynasty is kind of lost in the mists of time. There are various theories as to where the Pallavas actually came from. Dr. C. Meenakshi, who did her PhD from the University of Madras, and she was probably the first woman doctorate from University of Madras way back in the 1930s. Actually took Pallavas as the topic of her thesis, and it's her works that have still provided us a lot of insight into what this dynasty was about. They have been kind of by various historians termed as descendants of Pallavas, the Indo-Parthians. Some consider them to have come from the imperial Vakatakas from slightly north of Tamil Nadu. But the most popular theory is that the Pallavas originated from a Chola ruler and a Naga princess, which is also recorded in Manimegalai, one of the early Tamil works of literature. So wherever they came from, they settled in the Tondai Mandalam region, which is somewhat northern Tamil Nadu and probably just bordering into Andhra. And that was the region in which they came into being with their kingdom. They themselves considered that they were descendants of Dronacharya. So both Rajasimha Pallava, the Kailasanatha temple in Kanchipuram and the Vaikundaparaman temple in Kanchipuram. In Kailasanatha temple, it's more of an inscription. In Vaikundaparaman temple, you actually have panels which depict this history, starting all the way from Mahavishnu to Brahma, his progeny, so on and so forth, coming to Drona, and then his son Ashwatthama, and his son Ashwatthama is doing a penance, and he is enamored by an Apsara called Madani, and their offspring is considered the first Pallava. So that is kind of the lineage which they trace down to. And once they settled in this region, interestingly enough, both these dynasties were extremely feuding dynasties. They fought with each other almost through the entire duration of their common existence. So they feuded, but they also picked up a lot of temple construction from each other, and that's the reason it's called coopetition in stone, because they competed on the battlefield, they cooperated when it came to building these wonderful structures. The critical portion of these two dynasties is they were the first to start using rock as the fundamental material of temple construction. It's not that temples didn't exist prior to that, they did, but giving it a lasting legacy by using rock actually started independently in these two kingdoms in the south. Pallavas in Tamil Nadu, Chalukyas in Karnataka. Of course, Guptas had started it sometime back up north, but Mahendravarma Pallava actually starts it off in the 6th, 7th century time frame.
So Bharath, before this, then you say that these were the first to have started in the south temple construction using stone. And I think both of you talk about the different materials that were used by the Pallavas and the Chalukyas. One used, I think, soft stone, the other one used granite. But before that, what were temples constructed with? Do we know?
They were constructed with bricks, metal, wood, mortar, more. Well, they're not, I mean, they're still sustainable materials, but they're still perishable over time. So there is hardly any of that remaining in Tamil Nadu right now. None of those temples remain. And I think it's the same with Karnataka as well. Not many of those structures remain. There are very dilapidated one or two spots where you can see it. But, using rock, both of them started, and that starts a whole line of skill, a whole line of artisan guilds, a whole line of technical. In fact, if you go to Mahabalipuram, you can see rocks with small square holes on them. So they would cut these square holes, put wooden wedges in each of these holes, and wet the wood. They would put water on it, the wood would expand, and the stone would splice absolutely straight out. And that's how they would cut hard rock to create a face of a structure.
Oh wow! So if you look at Mahabalipuram, right, and you have covered some of the most popular temples there, the one closest to the shore is called the Shore Temple. And I believe there is one other temple that is mentioned in folklore, but was believed to have submerged, many 100 years or more than 1,000 years back. So we are left with the shore temple there. Now, so tell us a little bit about the shore temple in terms of what are some of the more striking aspects of that temple, and what should one, both as a pilgrim, as a photographer, as someone who may have an interest in photography, how should one approach the shore temple?
So, unfortunately, in these COVID times, the site, I think, is still closed. I'm not sure if it has opened up, but it opens up at 6 a.m. in the morning. There's a small fee that you have to pay because it's an ASI maintained site, and I think it's 20 rupees or 30 rupees. I don't remember the exact amount. You can get amazing shots of the silhouette of the temple against the sunrise. So that's a fantastic view that you will get. You're right in saying there were probably other structures behind. In fact, National Oceanographic Institute did do a survey. They did find some structures, but they've left it at that. The temple itself, was built during the time of Rajasimha Pallava, and there are three temples. There's a temple between the two structures that you typically see. The view of the shore temple is you'll have a smaller Vimana, and then behind that a larger Vimana. In between these two structures, there is a Vishnu temple, which is unfortunately blocked out for public. You can't go there because the structure is weakening and so on. So these two, one is Rajasimha Pallaveshwara, and the bigger temple is Kshatriya Simha Pallaveshwara. There are a lot of inscriptions also on these temples, including from Chola era. There is a large tank or a well-like structure that you will see, which has Varaha getting ready to dive into the ocean. So if you imagine that on a high tide day, the sea comes in and fills it, you will get the sense as if Varaha is just descending into the ocean to actually go and bring Bhudevi up. The current structure is maintained by ASI, and they've kind of arranged a lot of Nandis around the temple. Originally, that structure was not so. There are a lot of iconographical elements on the outer walls of the temple. You will see Tripurantaka on you have a wonderful Tripurantaka sculpture which they've retrieved and kept in one of the corridors. You will see a lot of Vaishnava iconography in the corridor which connects to the Vishnu temple of the structure. So it's the best time to go is absolutely at sunrise. You'll see the sun rise against it. It's a wonderful view and a photographer's delight to go at that point in time.
Excellent. I think our next trip to Mahabalipuram will be by some place near the temple, so we can hopefully, and I suggest people do that. Now, you talked about this one carving sculpture of Varaha getting ready to dive into the ocean, and that leads me to a question for you, Gurupreet. So if you go to Badami, so there are the cave temples, as you enter on the right-hand side, you climb up to the cave temples, and from there, then you see the Agastya Muni lake, and you see the Bhutnath, group of temples. And the view is absolutely stunning. So tell us a little bit about those temples, because a lot of people I have seen, in the few times that we have gone to Badami, we've seen most people will do the trek up to the cave temples, but not as many people seem to figure out a way to. And frankly, I think the approach road is also, it cuts through a village, so it's not exactly the most approachable of roads. But the Bhutnath group of temples is stunning, and there is something also, I think, on the left hand side which goes back even further. Tell us something about this capital of the Chalukyas and these temples there at Badami.
Right. Abhinavji, like you rightly said, people would head more into the caves versus the Bhutnath temple, and the reason for that is that the caves are a lot more ancient compared to the temple. They predate it by a few centuries. And in their time, these cave temples at Badami, which were patronized by the royal family, we have inscriptions there, and some of the earliest caves that were built there were built at the beginning of the 7th century. At that point in time, they are an extremely important representation of Hindu cave temple architecture. Because the only thing contemporary to that in the Deccan in terms of cave temple architecture would be the Elephanta or the Gurupreet cave, which is also mentioned in the Chalukyan inscriptions. We do not know who patronized that cave, but we see this new kind of sculptural template that comes into picture, like the iconography and the expression that was happening at the time of the Chalukyas has a very unique Deccani or Chalukyan theme to it. And we see that continuum happening right to the Elephanta caves and to the temples that they built, after that. So from here, I'd just like to move on to the point that, the main contribution of the Chalukyas, like you had said right at the beginning, even though they were there just for a period of around 240 odd years, is that they really created a very stable kingdom. Their kingdom is the Karnataka that we know of today, which was previously fragmented into many smaller kingdoms before they, became the Chakravartins of that particular area. So they were that buffer zone, which actually were like a very important political power that pushed back some of the Arab invasions that were happening at the beginning of the 8th century. And they actually, if they had not defeated them in Gujarat in the beginning of the 8th century, we would have had them invading far earlier into the south than actually what happened. And we would have not seen the creations like Ellora happening. Because what the Chalukyan polity did is, in addition to patronizing, they really created a system, they brought about that epoch wherein the local people who owned the temples, they patronized or they donated to the temples, and there was this effervescence of art. There were these trade guilds who were being encouraged to create these temples. And the most important bit is they really experimented with the temple styles. So they have cave temples, which are their earliest constructions. Right opposite to the cave temples, which you were asking me, there is an ancient fort, right, which is a natural cliff kind of a fort that was used by the royal family in its initial stages. And there also we have some of the earliest Dravida temples that have been built, the very basic structure of the Dravida temple. And they were pioneers in this kind of cave temple, finesse that they developed that did not exist at that point in time in the country. So before the Chalukyas, we had the Guptas and the Vakatakas that had created stone temples in a smaller scale. And we do see the brick temple also at Deoghar. So there was definitely this certain template existed. People were following the Agama Shastras and the Shilpa Shastras to create the temples. But the Chalukyas, what they did is they really bumped it up to a new scale because they really experimented with a lot of styles. For instance, we see this temple at Aihole, which is a combination of a Buddhist Shaitya Graha and a typical Nagara temple.
Correct. So at Aihole, we also see, I think, one of the oldest surviving temples in perhaps all of India and certainly in South India, right? And we also see, I believe, one of the few temples or few surviving temples of the Nagar style of architecture, right?
Yeah, so the Nagara style are more prevalent in the Pattadakal area. That is another very unique feature of the Chalukyas is that they really patronized both these styles. So it was not like they were only patronizing the Dravida style, but they patronized both the Nagara and the Dravida style. And in fact, we see a cross-pollination. For instance, a component from the Nagara temple, which is a very beautiful kind of artistic aesthetic that gets adopted and gets used on the Vimana of the Dravida temple, which was first done by them because they were working with both kinds of styles at the same site. And finally, what they do is with the creation of the Virupaksha temple, and which in turn is inspired by their interaction with the Pallavas. But they have an existing template, a simpler one, and they really go, like they really create an extremely intricate temple that they have never done before. And they do declare in the inscriptions that their intention is to create a new Karnataka style of temple building. So they're very well aware that deep south, the Pallavas are creating amazing, beautiful temples. And they also want to create their own style of temples and create like a Kashi for Shiva. And so they go all out to create this Virupaksha temple. And if you go to Ellora and you compare it to the Virupaksha sculptures or even the Vimana, it is like a 1:1 kind of a correlation. So it's pretty much like the Rashtrakutas who succeeded the Chalukyas were the ones who built Ellora. So that experimentation, that finesse, that evolution happened during the reign of the Chalukyas. So in that sense, really, the 2 centuries, they have really contributed a lot to the temple architecture.
Interesting. So you talked about Gurupreet, about their desire to build a Kanchi, and Bharath, I'll return to you now. You mention a shloka written by the great poet Kalidasa, who mentions Kanchi, right? And Kanchi is called the city of temples, and really there are, I think you mentioned that 14 of the 108 Divya Desams are in Kanchi itself.
Yep.
And the oldest temple there, I believe, is the Kailasanatha temple, right?
Yeah, it's considered the oldest structure, I would say. I wouldn't say specifically location-wise it would be older, because you see, there is always this thing that you have to balance out between what they consider as the Sthala Purana of that particular place and so on, versus the structure itself which exists. So,
interesting.
Considered one of the oldest structures.
And at Kanchi, as compared to Mahabalipuram or even Badami and other places, some of the most how should I say, some of the most majestic temples can be found in Kanchi.
Yes.
What kind of, and I want to get also to some discussions on the iconography of, those places. And, Gurupreet mentioned that the Pallavas wanted to build, and they adopted some of the styles, but they built their own unique style. How should one, is there a common unifying theme as far as iconography is concerned at the temples of Kanchi?
Yes. So each kingdom, I think, had its own mechanism of depicting certain divine iconography. So the best example that I can give you is the Sandhya Tandava or the Kunchita pose that you see in Kanchipuram of Shiva dancing. And this pose, I think, was very specific to the Pallavas. The Cholas eventually came up with the form of Nataraja that they depict, with his feet raised. But in the Pallava style of Nataraja, you will see a very different dancing pose than what you will see typically with the Chola Nataraja. The leg is not raised the way it is. He's more on a how to say, it's called the Kunchita pose. It's very difficult for me to explain without actually being able to show the image itself. But you will see a very different depiction here. That said, a lot of the other iconography is quite common. The Lingodbhava, very common, where it shows Brahma on top, actually flying up as a swan, Vishnu at the bottom going out as a boar, and Shiva himself emerging from the pillar of fire. If you take a look at some of the other iconography in terms of Tripurantaka and so on, they are all quite common that you see as styles that were picked up by subsequent kingdoms and taken forward. The Dakshinamurti in the early Pallava temples is actually quite different from, again, what you see later on. It's a very relaxed kind of pose that you will see Dakshinamurti sitting amidst animals, sitting with deer under his feet, with monkeys on the trees, with lions and tigers to his side. So it's a very different iconography. The Bhikshatana that you will see is also slightly different. The Kailasanatha temple is probably very esoteric in that sense. It's very evolved in its depictions. You will not see a single image where there is not a smile playing on Shiva's lips. You will see very unique forms that you generally don't see in other temples. And all of this, of course, was picked up, refined, perfected, taken to a different level, different elements crept into the way things were depicted by the following kingdoms. So therefore, you will see modifications, but the fundamental stories are still the same, right? On the wall, you will find Dakshinamurti on the south side. You will find Lingodbhava on one side. You will find Durga on the other side. So all of these forms still are pretty much the same even in Chola temples, where they are positioned, where they become part of the temple structure. All of those are quite similar.
I see. And so, Gurupreet, returning to Pattadakal, now I can't recall any place I have been to where I have seen such a collection, literally you can see an explosion of temples, all in very, very small geographical area. Now, is there any particular reason why, even though the capital of the Chalukyas is Badami, but we see in Pattadakal so many temples come up?
So Pattadakalu, even as the name suggests, was probably a place where the coronations happened. So it was probably a second capital, secondary to Badami, like a safe haven for the royalty in case there were any attacks on Badami. So Pattadakalu also was considered to be a Tirtha Kshetra. It was a Tirtha Kshetra way before the Chalukyas, came into power. And we normally, in Sanatani, civilization, what we assume rivers to be extremely, pure, and they really signify purity and are the places where mainly the temples are built. And especially if a river flows northward, that becomes a very sanctified place, and that is normally where you would want to construct a temple. So that is what was seen here. There is a Malprabha river that takes a turn and starts flowing towards the north. And on the banks of the Malprabha river, there were already temples in the past. And it is the Chalukyas who came in and appropriated it. In a sense, they started renovating and they actually created that landscape. Like initially, they started with the Nagara temples. There were only Nagara temples. And another really important thing is that because they patronize the Nagara temples, we get to see that fully constructed Nagara temples standing there, because the counterparts that existed in the northern part of the country are currently not at all visible to us. So that is really an important bit where we get to see a fully fledged basic template of the Nagara temple. And then later onwards, we see they are, focus on creating their own unique style, which is more of a Dravida style as we know it today. And it's mainly a Shaiva Kshetra. We see a lot of inscriptions mentioning the existence of Pashupata Shaivism at the site. So it was a very sanctified site. And from this inscriptional evidence, we also find that their intent was to create another Kashi. So Kashi was like the most hallowed place across country, pan-India, irrespective of whichever region you came from. Especially if you were a Shaiva Bhakta, you would consider Kashi to be like, the center of your spiritual kind of, compass. And Ganga, of course, Ganga and the Kashi combination is always revered. So that is something that we see. We see in the inscription, they're trying to proclaim that Pattadakalu is the Kashi of the Chalukyan kingdom. The aim is to develop those kind of complexes and universities and provide those kind of endowments and create, that environment that Kashi would have had. And Malprabha then becomes a river Ganga for the people. So that's the amount of love that we see for Kashi. And there are these many pan-Indic themes, like for instance, which Bharath mentioned, and which you can see in my background, that the same theme of Nataraja is being depicted very differently. both by the Pallavas and the Chalukyas, because they would have derived their inspiration from the Puranic episodes or from the Upanishads, and they would have, of course, used their own regional sensibilities to develop it. And there would always be diversity in the depiction because, even civilizationally, we've always tried to express the core idea in multi-varied, ways. So the different kinds of temples that existed, the temple styles, even within Nagara, there are multiple styles, and the same within the Dravida is not a very simple style. So if you go to Karnataka, Andhra, and Tamil Nadu, you will see a marked difference in the way the temples are constructed, even though maybe the base would be similar. So we see that diversity. At the same time, we see this existence pan-India, reverence to the itihasas, episodes from the Mahabharata and Ramayana being depicted on the Sabha Mandapas of the temple, where everybody would have had access to them, or they are reverence to the Natya Shastra, or schools being developed in Patadakallu, where we have a list of dancers who were following the Natya Shastra and running the schools, and over quite a few generations. So there is this pan-Indic cultural continuity that was a very obvious construct for me when I started reading about the Chalukya dynasty, and that is what we see even in their interaction with the Pallavas. That when they invade Kanchi, they are so bewitched, even though they have a political difference and logically would want to destroy the city, right? They do not destroy Kanchi, which is again a very revered site itself, but they set up an endowment for the temple, and they derive inspiration from Kailasanatha, because it is such so forward for its time, and it is so intricate that they are bewitched and mesmerized, and they go back inspired, and they want to create their own Kashi, and they proclaim it that way. So this is, like a pan-Indic cultural continuum that, we could see when we try to research for the book.
Very interesting. A theme that that can be seen in many places where kingdoms, even though they were rivals and they had continuous battles and wars over the centuries, yet it was never or rarely accompanied by any kind of iconoclasm that we got to see in the centuries that followed. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the book itself. Now, when you started how to put this? Tell us a little bit about the idea for the book, because we all go to temples and we'll do our darshan and we'll take photographs and all. But obviously, both of you took it to 1, 2, 3, to several levels higher than that. And tell us a little bit about the inspiration for the book.
You'd like to
Yes.
or shall I? Actually, I just realized I could have just moved my head and showed you the Pallava Nataraja and then the Chalukya.
Exactly.
So,
yes.
Right. So somehow skipped my mind. Anyway, so the inspiration for the book, both Guri and I used to put these tweets with on the temples that we visited on Twitter, and it caught the eye of actually the person without whom this book wouldn't have been possible, which was Dimple. She took a look at the threads and she contacted us and said, why don't you do a coffee table book? Indica wants to do a coffee table book. You guys have collected so many photographs and you keep putting it out on Twitter, which is more of an impermanent platform. It gets deleted, goes away. You can actually put it down and so many people would be interested in going through the book. So that's how it started. And Dimple had a specific reason in bringing the both of us together, because we have, you have to be very wary of Gurupreet. She can remove her talwar and come behind you if you, get her riled up. She's a Sikhi. So
I don't know what he's talking about.
So with a South Indian and a North Indian, that too somebody from with her roots in Punjab. So she said two of them coming together, putting this book together would have been a dream project for her. So that's how we came together. Why we chose Pallavas and Chalukyas was actually quite obvious, because contemporaries, feuding kingdoms, at the same time they were pioneers in whatever they undertook in terms of temple construction. So it gelled very nicely to bring these two kingdoms together and bring it out as a single coffee table book. And it plays off the dynasties and their constructions play off each other. Their inscriptions of the Chalukya kings on Pallava temples, the Vatapi Ganapati being brought back to Tamil Nadu and still installed and being prayed to, all those constructions are there. So two contemporary kingdoms made eminent sense for us to bring them together.
So this is fascinating. And roughly how many, so Gurupreet, roughly how, over what period of time did you take these photographs that have found their way into this book?
Right. So Abhinavji, for me, it was just a 2-day trip to Badam, where I was very trigger happy, and I was mesmerized by the cave temples as well as at Patadakalu. Within a few hours, whatever I could capture, and I think it was kind of like a divine grace that I was able to get some good pictures which I could then use. So for me, again, I'm not a professional, in the field of arts or a professional photographer. I'm from the STEM background, and what I used was my mobile phone and a good editing software to clear the pictures. And so for me also, this journey was like really from somebody who just was passionate about understanding the temples. And I was always completely mesmerized by what we could create. I just could not make sense of it, because how could we create something so beautiful and then lose the context for it? Because we barely see footfall at these places. These should be like the most prized possessions for us, and they are not under active puja, and we are not visiting them, and they are mostly empty most of the time. And this is something that I want to really share with people, and that's how we started writing. And frankly, this thing was never in my mind ever that I would write about this, or that there would be some literature associated. It was just a very casual, tweeting some threads covering multiple temples. And I think Dimple and Indica Academy really trusted us. They could see that, especially Dimple could see that ability in us. She could see the possibility that we could bring out something like this. And the time that it took us to bring out the book, to create the full book end to end, for us, it took almost like a year, because we started with like a completely blank slate. We picked up our own separate sections, and we were not sure how to go about it. So it was a learning process for us. There were many iterations, with the editor as well as then later with the publisher, because there's a lot of photo editing that goes in a coffee table book. It's not that easy. In fact, it's easier to bring out a novel like with text, but with a coffee table book, there are various, placement issues, style design issues which come into the picture. And we've learned a lot in the process. So the book was created within a year, but then COVID happened, and then it got delayed for another, maybe almost a year. So it took end to end around 2 years for the book to really become a reality. And I think in that process, the amount of research that we did is actually very minuscule. We are not really experts on this, but we've learned a lot about that Bharath that is literally hidden. We don't know about our own country. We don't know about our own civilization legacy. We don't value the fact that the temple is a very visible marker that is standing there for us to study, to accept, and to co-own and, protect and preserve. We don't really look at it in that fashion. And this is something that, both of us really wanted to bring out in the book. And we hope that, this will create some sort of interest, not just in the Pallava or Chalukya temple spaces, but in general, that people get out, they understand the themes that are behind the iconography. They understand, the different visuals that are depicted there in the Mahabharata and Ramayana. They also understand what we had and what we lost, and therefore now what is needed to be done, because our temples may not exist in the exact same vibrant function that they had in the past, where they could become the epicenter of society. They're not in the same way, at least not all of them are. Some of the major temples might still be functioning that way, but majority of the smaller temples or the regional temples are not functioning that way. There is a regional disconnect. In Maharashtra, when I studied in my school, I literally did not even know about the Chalukyas. There was not a single mention. And they have still created such beautiful temples. I mean, Ellora is, of course, given space, but Chalukyas are not. Some of the temples are not. And I was actually flabbergasted when I visited those places that really, I mean, this should have been a school trip for us. We should have done this. So this is what we try to really focus on.
I think, yes, we as an independent nation have taken cultural ignorance to levels, I think, never seen before in our entire history. And we seem to take it as a matter of pride, which is in itself a discussion that deserves its own own discussion. But so no, you talked about the research and that you've barely scratched the surface, but there are almost 48 or 49 references that you have listed in your book, and some of the ones that come to mind or are striking are obviously Dr. C. Meenakshi, there's Dr. Nagaswamy, and then there's Dr. Chitra Madhavan and all. So let's take a step back and say that I am visiting these temples again, and I say that I obviously have to carry this book, with me. By way, what would your recommendation be? And this is to both of you, Bharath and Gurupreet, to someone who says that I want to learn a little more about these places. What would you recommend? Apart from your book, what would be the second or third references you would recommend?
So. The law. So there are a few things to be kept in mind. One is the purpose behind the visit. There are various elements to the temple. Is it the historical element that you're trying to cover? Is it the spiritual element that you're trying to cover? Is it the iconographic element that you're trying to cover? Is it the philosophical element that you're trying to cover? Because each one of these is a very deep dive topic by itself. So few things that I would recommend, particularly when it comes to the structural element of it, the architecture element of it, would be Stella Kramrich's books. There are two-part books. They're available at archive.org on the Hindu temple. I think those two give you a very in-depth element of the way temples were constructed, the mandala patterns that were chosen, the various activities that were done for a temple construction, from identifying the site, clearing the site, purification of the site, laying of the first stone, to so on and so forth, right? So, and who were the principal actors in building such a temple? That is another topic that's covered very nicely in those books. The recently Indica published Temple Management in the Agamas by Dr. Deepa Duraiswamy. Another book that I think I would strongly recommend everybody to pick a copy of, because there it goes deep into the way Agamas have designed temple worship and temple structure and construction to managing a functioning temple. Who are the actors who are responsible for the various functions within a temple? Because temple is a complex service organization. Now, it is a complex service organization that, of course, does service to the Lord on behalf of the populace that is present in that particular location. But nevertheless, there is a series of activities that are done. It's a service organization that will exist whether a devotee comes in or doesn't come, right? So there are various elements to managing a temple. There are various components of it, and that's covered very nicely in that book. Specific historical references, depending on the dynasty, you'll have to pick up a book. For Pallavas, I would say C. Meenakshi is right up there, because she knows the research that she did was so in-depth, and the three theses that she published are absolutely, gives you the complete lay of the land when it comes to these kingdoms. Similarly, there are books for the Cholas, there are books for other kingdoms, and so on and so forth. So this is what I would recommend as what one should pick up when it comes to trying to understand temples.
Perfect. I'll take one. We have so people are, please feel free to send in your questions. I'll take one that has come in from Gopal. And he asks, why do you think the iconography of Shiva dancing pose was different for Pallava and Cholas? Was their lineage, does their lineage have anything to do with it?
It is not to do with lineage. I think it is the aesthetic choices that some of these kingdoms made in the styles that they followed. So the Cholas obviously picked it up very differently. The Pallavas picked it up from a very different verse in Natya Shastra. In fact, if you go into my book, I would have mentioned the verse and the way it describes, the way Shiva is shown in that Kunchita pose. So I think it's what each kingdom picked up as its aesthetic. So the way you see it in the Chalukya right behind me, that is very different from what you would generally see as a Nataraja dancing pose. This one is very different, but it's essentially capturing the cosmic dance of the Lord. There are multiple poses. Probably one pose struck a kingdom more than the other poses, and that's how it got picked up. So there's no specific reason to say why did they pick it up in this way. At least it's not documented.
Okay, I see. Add one thing. Add one thing here is that even within the Chalukyas, when they were representing the same iconography, there are differences between the cave temples and the actual Dravida temples that were built. And even between two temples built within the same century, there are differences. So we have to understand that our creative processes are very different. We don't follow a very rigid set template. So we do have instructions about the measurements, about the specific iconography, about the different weapons that that particular manifestation would hold, and the vahana, etc. But there is always a lot of space for that particular guild or that particular sthapati, the person who's creating the sculpture, based on his experience over the years, over the decades, to create it. And every piece is unique because it is almost like an act of devotion. It cannot be uniform across, even within the same kingdom, and definitely not as in when we move across geography. So we will see completely different manifestations. For example, the earliest manifestation of Rajendra Moksham we see in the Gupta temple at Diogad, that is like, 5th century. And then we see Gajendra Moksham in Chalukyas, built by the Chalukyas on Virupaksha temple. Very similar poses and very similar iconography, but it's separated by like almost 2.5 centuries, right? And it's completely different, even though you can understand that it's the same Puranic episode that is being depicted. And if you were to see that same theme, even Bhuvaraha Swami theme, for example, within two cave temples that exist in the same site of Badami, they're different because a different group worked on it at different points in time. So that diversity is a very natural expression of Sanatani aesthetic that is always going to be there.
There's on this same theme, there is a question that has come up from Sri Guruprasad, and he asks, have you come across any school of sculpture in current days following either Pallava or Chalukya style of sculpture while building modern temples?
So the measurements of both the temples and the iconography have over time been crystallized in various texts of Vastu Shastra. So there is Manasara, Shilpasara. The Agamas themselves have very specific definitions of the way structures ought to be built, the dimensions of them, and so on and so forth. The some of the texts like Shukraniti even capture for a particular iconography, this is the height in which the forehead ought to be. This is the distance between the eye and the tip of the nose to the chin, so on and so forth. So the point that I'm trying to make is we were a very thorough civilization when it came to putting these things down on paper and recording them, and they are very much available. As far as modern temples go, there's hardly any modern temple construction actually going on. Of course, we have Ram Mandir. The Birlas have built a few temples. In the Birla temples, you see largely these iconographical elements and the structural elements being adopted as well. as far as so you must understand that these are also evolving texts, right? They come and they're recorded and so on, because material is also changing. When I first go and hit rock, I'm hitting hard rock, and all I did was excavate into it, create 3 chambers, and install the deity within, right? I didn't have the skill set to make the pillar ornate, make a vimana structure, make a mandapa within. So all those are developing skills and techniques which eventually led to the Pallava shore temple, or to Kailasanatha, or to Vaikundaparaman temple. The Cholas came, picked it up, and took it to a different scale at the end of the day. So all these have crystallized and come to that. The elements are there, the structure, the dimensions, etc., are recorded in texts. They can obviously be used to reconstruct such temples for sure.
So, as we come to the close of this Q&A, Bharath and Gurupreet, I think there is, we have answered this question. So as we come to the end of this Q&A, any parting thoughts that you would like to leave for your viewers and for people who buy your book? Any parting thoughts you would like to share?
Guri?
Yeah. So, like I said, the entire aim behind the book, like, we are not experts per se, but what we try to do is give people a complete, a complete exhibition of the various iconography that are present at the temples, why a temple existed, how the society functioned around it, what are the different components of the temple. We have briefly mentioned the names of the Shastras or the Agamas that were being referred to for the creation of these temples. We have tried to bring out the pan-Indian cultural themes that existed, of, like a cultural continuum that existed across the country. And you can easily contrast it from the 2 sections of the book. So my only, appeal to the reader is to, at the end of it, my only hope is that you're able to come out of this, this experience with some better understanding or conceptualization of these marvelous creations, which were not just architectural creations, but they were the most powerful consecrated spaces meant for spiritual, socio-economic development. And these are our legacy. And, if we even look at the works of art that they have created, we cannot exactly replicate them today because we have lost the consciousness to be able to perceive divinity in that fashion and create it. Today the art is more towards realism. We try to imitate people, or create even divinity in the image of man. But even when it was done in the past, it was done with a lot of aesthetic understanding of the core philosophical concepts, and it's really connected with a common lay person who maybe would not know a lot about the Shastras, but could still enter the temple and could still feel completely connected to that image. So we have to be able to dig deeper into these concepts and own the civilization legacy. It's there for us. And thankfully, we are lucky that even though 80% of it has been wiped off the face of our land, but there are a lot of these still there. Many of them are lying derelict, abandoned, smaller structures. I think once there is this consciousness, once there is this kind of co-ownership at the grassroots level, most of our problems in terms of addressing, issues of that we're having currently with temples that are currently already functioning, as well as even the ones which are currently with ASI, will go away. And I think it will really create that spirit of inquiry, because once you look at a sculpture, then you want to understand what is the theme behind it. When you see a temple, you want to understand how the consecration happens, how is the temple managed, how is it relevant to me, what did it do for my ancestors. There are so many questions which is going to bring us closer, to our own past and our own identity. And that is, what I would really hope that, we can solve some of this, or at least push people towards these questions through this book.
Bharath.
Yeah, I think Guri's already covered, what I would have wanted to say as well. I think the thing is, times are difficult. People are not able to move out and visit and so on. But I would say it's important that we go back to visiting temples regularly. That is a practice which is, at least in the urban centers, has gone down significantly. Something that needs to be revived. When we were younger, it used to be probably a weekly affair. At least once there would be a visit, but of late you hardly see any families visiting temples. And I think we need to revive that completely, because there are innumerable assaults that are happening on this ecosystem. Particularly when you come to Tamil Nadu, you will see it even more prominently. And unless we build that connect, and here I would like to take an example of what happened when I visited Nellayappar in Neyveli. We went early in the morning, 6 o'clock. The main sanctum doors were still closed, because what happens is in the Palliyarai, or the sleeping chamber, the Utsavamurti is taken, and both the Lord and Amman are together, and then in the morning it's brought out. So when we went there and it was still locked, there was a devotee standing there, and he actually said, Appa Amma kitta perkar varuvar. That is, Appa has gone to mother, he will be back. That is the kind of connect that he has with the temple, with the deity within, and it's a daily affair for him. That's the kind of, how to say, such a deep-rooted connection that exists. And that somewhere has unfortunately disappeared, particularly, as I said, in the urban centers. And I think read the book, understand the concepts, look at the iconography, all that is fine, but start visiting again, going back to temples again, build that connect again, so that forces that are coming and are inimical to our way of life are held at bay. Unless we have that connect, I think it's very difficult.
Very true. And one suggestion that I can give from personal experience is that the one purpose that iconography also serves in our temples is that it brings alive to people of all ages the stories and episodes from our texts. So I have, for instance, at the Hoysala temples in Belur and Halabad and so many other places, it has served us and my children so many hours of just watching and taking in all the different episodes, whether it is from the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or the Sagar Manthan. These episodes, so my suggestion also would be to people to bring your kids from a very young and tender age to temples and make them alive to your children. And you're very right. Unfortunately, our temples have been replaced by other structures, whether it is malls or what you call, so people prefer going there to celebrate. I would say temples are a more lasting form of celebration of our way of life. So Gurupreet and Bharath, thank you so much for this Q&A, for coming on the Indica Books Q&A and for sharing your thoughts. For everyone, the book is Pallavas and Chalukyas, Co-optation in Stone. It is an Indica imprint and has been published by Notion Press. It is available on Amazon and other places. It is it's a gorgeous celebration, a very pictorial celebration of temples from only two of the great dynasties of India, the Pallavas and the Chalukyas. Please take a moment to browse the book, buy the book, and you can follow both Gurupreet and Bharath on Twitter. So Bharath, your handle is BRAKOO, Braku.
Right. Yeah.
And
don't ask me
yes, I've been wanting to ask you since you brought this up. Please, why is it?
No, it's just a nickname from engineering time, which some senior gave, and it stuck on, and I kind of started using it, and therefore it became my.
And for people who don't know, Bharath is also a big fan of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. So that is another element that I think connection between us. Gurupreet, your Twitter handle is Guric.
Gurichopra, Guri Chopra.
Guri Chopra, sorry, yeah. So it is Guri Chopra, so please follow them. And if you get the book, please also share your feedback, write a review on Amazon, let them know on Twitter also that you've bought the book and any feedback. And we only hope that not only does this book do well, but we get to see another collaboration between you, maybe the Hoysalas and the Cholas. I don't know, but I can only hope. So we will put this this Q&A up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. And please do follow us at Indica Books on Twitter. And with that, thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.